Hello, everyone. It's time to talk about Don't Breathe. So, Don't Breathe, it came out in 2016, and it was a sleeper hit, as they say. And what that means is basically when it first came out, it didn't get much attention, but gradually it got a lot of attention. So, it is what we call a sleeper hit. It was directed by Uruguayan director Fede Alvarez, who was discovered on YouTube in 2009 with a short film he made. So, he was an influencer before there were influencers. So this is his follow-up to Evil Dead, which came out in 2013. So, he wanted to make a movie that was sort of the opposite or the antithesis of Evil Dead. Evil Dead was a remake of a Sam Raimi movie, and Sam Raimi is basically the person who got him his start in Hollywood. He got Fede Alvarez his start. So, whereas Evil Dead was a remake, Don't Breathe is totally original. It's all Alvarez's idea. And it also is non-supernatural as a horror story, which Alvarez felt was overused. He thought supernatural elements were passé, as it were, and so he opted for a totally non-supernatural horror story. But there's also the question of whether it's realistic in terms of how it represents the blind man, which is our guiding question throughout this PowerPoint and discussion. So, while we're on genre, let's talk about the genre of this movie. So it is horror, as I said previously. It's non-supernatural horror, and horror constitutes, of course, using our fears, right, in order to scare us with the contents of whatever movie is in the horror genre. So there are 5 basic fears that all humans share, generally speaking. The fear of extinction, the fear of mutilation. So extinction, of course, meaning death. The fear of mutilation, the fear of your bodily integrity being compromised, getting hurt, injured. Loss of autonomy, where you lose control of yourself, where you no longer have control of your body. So if you think of things like demonic possession, or someone becoming a zombie, that clearly is playing into loss of autonomy. And of course we see mutilation and death in horror movies all the time. There's also the fear of separation, of being alone, right? So there's that, and there's also the fear of ego death, which is basically when you're scared of losing your identity, of having no idea who you are or what your purpose is. That is ego death, and we're scared of that as well. So horror movies manipulate these fears we all generally have in order to scare us. So we can see mutilation, obviously, in terms of the blind man, because he was not born blind, but he did lose his sight. So that'll tie into our discussion of how he's represented in the movie. And then there's also a loss of autonomy, which I think is a big part of this movie, because we have the three main characters, the 3 thieves. They are trapped in the house, being pursued by the blind man. So they have lost control of themselves by being trapped. So we can see how it plays with our fears. We also see death, of course. We do see Money get mutilated, although he kind of deserved it. But yeah, so it uses fears that we all share to scare us. Notably, also, this movie is in the subgenre of slasher. So slasher movies are usually about teenagers. and these characters, I think they are teenagers. The three robbers, if not early 20s, mid 20s at the latest. But young people being pursued by a twisted killer is a hallmark of the slasher subgenre of horror. And with slasher movies, they almost always include a morality play, by which they show bad characters getting punished for doing bad things. And in the case of something like Friday the 13th, which is a classic slasher movie, we have teens who are sexually promiscuous getting killed by Jason's mother in Friday the 13th, the first one, or by some sort of supernatural incarnation of Jason himself in subsequent films. So, yeah. Basically, the slasher genre almost always includes teenagers doing wrong things, like having too much sex, for example, and being killed as a result. And we also saw that in our at the beginning of the course, when we watched that documentary about Lover's Lane, that story about a killer killing teens because they were too sexually promiscuous, and it's meant to teach a lesson. Don't be like the teens who get killed, is what it's trying to say. The movie also includes a final girl in the form of Rocky. The final girl is it's just what it sounds like. This is a trope in the slasher genre, and, also can be in the horror genre more broadly, where there's one final survivor who has to run away from the killer and outwit him to survive, and that is the final girl. So it does include typical parts of the slasher genre, because we do have a twisted killer in the form of the blind man. We do have young people being pursued by him. And on the face of it, it would seem that they are being punished for robbing the blind man. Although it's a bit more complicated than that, because the blind man is not exactly a good guy himself, and the teens, or the young thieves, they have reasons for wanting to steal that money that could be considered noble, especially Rocky, who just wants to escape to California with her sister. So, in short, the movie really blurs the line of who is good and who is bad. So it really plays with moral ambiguity, and it really flips the script of the slasher genre, because it's not a clear-cut morality play where the young people are bad and the killer is bringing about proper justice. It's much more complicated, and it's not all black and white. It's morally gray in the movie. So we'll explore how it plays with moral ambiguity in a second. But first I want to talk about Don't Breathe and Disability, and our discussion of moral ambiguity in the film will tie back into the theme of disability in the film. So, horror films have a history of deriving their scares from depictions of physical disabilities. For example, back in 1932, there was this movie called Freaks. And in this movie, this trapeze artist, part of this traveling circus, she tries to marry this little person who is one of the performers in the freak show. And she only is doing it to get his money. But he finds out because he sees her kissing the strong man. And then the freaks, quote unquote freaks, the circus performers, with different bodies. They come at her in the night, on a rainy, stormy night, when she's traveling in the caravan, and they get her and they mutilate her and they turn her into a human duck. So it is kind of weird, but basically it is sympathetic towards the little person in that movie, and it is sympathetic towards the circus performers, but it also is using what they look like to scare the audience, and I'll show you that right now. And it's also sympathetic towards them in that it shows the trapeze artist, her name is Cleo, it shows her being disgusted at the circus performers when they welcome her into their group because they think she's really marrying the little person for love, right? And so the film is sympathetic towards the performers, the freak, quote unquote, performers, but it also tries to scare us with how they look. And it is a morality play, sort of like an antecedent to the slasher genre, in that she gets what she deserves. Cleo does, but she, of course, gets what she deserves in the form of she is made into a quote-unquote freak herself. So perhaps not the best message in the case of that old movie, because it is saying the worst thing that could happen to her is to become like the freaks. So yeah, that is just to illustrate that horror movies have always, almost always, since the very beginning of cinema and the horror movie genre, has depended on using physical disability to scare people, because these people look different and therefore they're scary, was the thought process. Horror movies also tend to lean on narrative prosthesis. Now, if you remember, narrative prosthesis is basically using physical disability in a character to show that they're bad. And we see that in things like, throwing it all the way back like 100 years ago, Phantom of the Opera. And so, with these antecedents in mind, we could see the blind man himself as a monster. Like the Phantom of the Opera is portrayed as a monster. And I think this poster I picked for the slideshow, really sort of reinforces that. He looks like a monster in that poster, doesn't he? With his creepy house in the background and his creepy stare. So he could be used, in the way characters with disabilities have been used in horror movies before, as literal monsters. But he shatters many stereotypes about blind people at the same time, because he totally is not helpless, and he's capable even outside of his house. The stereotype could be blind people can only get around in spaces they know. But when he's outside his house, he is just as capable, even though Rocky thought he wouldn't be. And he also doesn't have super hearing or anything, with a stereotype of blind people. Their other senses make up for their blindness. He doesn't really exhibit that. He uses his other senses, like his touch, when he finds their shoes, to discover how many people are in the house. But sometimes he can't hear when someone is around, so super hearing isn't something he has, which, shatters another typical stereotype. And by that token, the title "Don't Breathe" might be meant to be ironic, because it doesn't seem like he can hear you breathe unless you're breathing really loud. But yeah, the blind man could be your typical horror movie disabled character portrayed as a monster, Or he could be, or he could be a genuine, accurate, positive representation of a blind person in media. So we're gonna keep talking about disability in the movie, and we're going to do so by means of looking at various symbols. So the first symbol is the ladybug, which Rocky befriends when her mother locks her in the trunk of the car. And she commemorates that event with a tattoo of the ladybug on her arm. The ladybug, of course, shows up later to show her the security system, which she activates to disorient the blind man with its sound. So the ladybug is definitely a symbol of freedom, a symbol of escape, because she made friends with the ladybug while she was being abused by her mother as a form of temporary escape, and then finally the ladybug shows her to her freedom. So yeah, the ladybug is a symbol of freedom, and it also sort of it also highlights the disability, tying it back to disability. It is related to the disability of Rocky's mother, which would be alcoholism, and the ladybug represents an escape from all of the harm that it's done on Rocky. So I think the ladybug also just sort of underscores how a person's disability can negatively affect them. And that leads us now to the turkey baster, which shows how the blind man's disability negatively affects him, because he's lost his sight and he's also lost his child. And I think the turkey baster, quite obviously, is a symbol for his drastic reaction to facing so much loss in his life. And he ends up corrupted because of how he feels after losing so much, his sight, his daughter, or his child. So the turkey baster also, I would say, represents how a person can be negatively affected by their disability, depending on how they react to it. Because the blind man, he never says that he hates being blind or anything like that. And I don't think the movie presents blindness as necessarily a bad thing to be, or a bad thing to have. But it does show through the turkey baster that when you react a certain way to your situation in life, you can end up doing pretty horrible things, like he does with the turkey baster, obviously. And next we had liminal security. So this is the security system that the security company run by Alex's dad. And it is a word, liminal. That word basically means in between. Y'all may have heard of a liminal space before, but a liminal space is a space that lies between a starting point and a destination. So no one makes a destination out of a liminal space. A liminal space is just a means of getting where you need to go. For example, a hallway or something like that could be considered a liminal space. I would think the biggest liminal space in the movie is the air conditioning, the vents that Rocky climbs through. And after she climbs through those vents, it leads her into the situation where she is captured by the blind man and about to be artificially inseminated. So it really goes from literal liminality to figurative liminality. or perhaps I should say moral liminality, because the blind man, he is obviously doing an evil thing, but he tries to justify it to himself by saying, I'm not a rapist. So, and we do sort of feel for him. Of course, his actions are not justified, but we feel for him for losing his child. So, he sort of is between a an evil, twisted killer and someone who we should sympathize with. So he is between himself. He is liminal himself. And the kids, I would argue, are the teenagers or the young people, whatever you want to call them. The three robbers, with the possible exception of money, they're also quite liminal because we can't really say if they're all good or all bad. They're somewhere in between. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so we'll save that for later on in the PowerPoint. 2978. So I'm just going to straight up say that this is the director's birthday, February 9th, 1978. But if you really wanted to stretch it, you could come up with this. Okay, so through this simple mathematic formula, we see that if you add 2 plus 9, you get 11. And 7 times 8 is 56? 56. And if you multiply 11 by 56, you get 616. Okay, Bible trivia time. In the earliest manuscripts of the book of Revelation, the number of the beast is 616. 666 is a later version. So that means the blind man could be... The blind man could be the devil. Not literally, but he could represent the devil. I think it is interesting that he has a dog, and of course for protection. But if you know Greek mythology, you might know about Cerberus, the three-headed dog, who resides in Hades. So we could also see the blind man residing in a sort of underworld. And of course he also has that line, there's nothing a man cannot do once he accepts the fact that there is no God. So he is an atheist, and I think the film is implying that he becomes an atheist after he loses his daughter. If you actually go and look closely in the scene where Money goes into his bedroom, if you look closely, you can see that there is the outline of a cross on the wall. So, yes, it really wants to emphasize that he doesn't believe anymore as a Christian, that it would have that detail of the cross not hanging above his bed anymore. And such details might try to show that he is, as someone who is anti-Christian, he could be demonic. And the reason I say that also is because this is a horror movie, going back to its genre. And horror movies often have demonic antagonists, like in movies like The Exorcist, or in movies like The Conjuring, as a more recent example. And of course, demons are always bad. That's what they are. They're bad. But like we alluded to earlier, this film isn't so black and white with who is good and who is bad. And of course, even though the blind man is not a Christian, he's not necessarily evil. Of course, he's doing evil things, but is he himself evil, or is he just a product of a product of his circumstances. So I think it is ironic that it's really emphasizing his deconversion from Christianity, trying to set him up as this demonic sort of monster. But of course, this is real life. This isn't a supernatural horror movie, and Alvarez meant to make a horror movie that's not supernatural. This is a direct response, even, we could say, to supernatural horror movies. The blind man is seemingly set up as this demon and this monster who is just pure evil. But when you get down to it, he's a human, a very flawed human, but he's human, and that's perhaps what makes his actions all the more scary. So let's look at the flip side of it, though. The blind man also could be seen as sympathetic. He is a Gulf War veteran, very noble in our culture to serve, right? He also experienced quite a bit of loss, as we talked about before. He lost his vision, he lost his daughter, and not only that, he lost the justice that he would have gotten had the justice system been fair. So I think we are meant to feel for him and connect with him on a human level. Like I said before, even though this is a horror movie, and even though it seems to set him up as a demon or a monster for how he looks with his blindness and his eyes, and for his not having Christianity might mean he's some sort of demon, but actually he's just a guy, right? And we are supposed to feel for him. Nonetheless, his actions are of course reprehensible, and Money, when he says that famous line, just because he's blind, that doesn't mean he's a saint. That ends up being true. He's not a saint. But who is, right? And that leads me to the next place. Because everyone has good and bad in them, the movie says. It sort of wants to shatter horror movie tropes and slasher movie tropes where everyone is either good or bad. So we don't have demons and monsters who are all bad in this movie, and we don't have protagonists who are Christians like the exorcists in The Exorcist, who are all good in this movie. We just have people who are flawed, because all people are flawed. And, you know, we are supposed to sympathize with the robbers. Rocky, with her rocky life, I don't think her name is accidental. She just wants to escape to a better life with her sister. She wants to leave her abusive home, and that's why she's doing this. That's why she's committing this robbery. And Alex is committing this robbery out of empathy, out of compassion for Rocky. He doesn't need the money. You know, he's a middle-class guy. We saw his house, and he lives with his dad, who runs this security company. So he's strictly doing this out of his concern for Rocky and her sister. I think the only one who is not sympathetic is Money, because, as his name implies, all he wants is money, and that's why he's doing this. So, money the object, not the person, can be seen as a corrupting influence. It corrupts Money so much, and we know that because it's literally his name, and he's definitely the most unsympathetic of the three. But on the flip side, with Money, the blind man's money doesn't ease his pain at all, and the movie really underscores that, because he has not just the 300,000 that they thought he had 1 million. So yeah, Money really money can be corrupting. The movie shows us, and I think the closest thing to a totally bad person, villain, we might even say, in the movie is money. But it also shows that money can be liberating in the case of Rocky, and that it can do nothing for a person in the case of the blind man. So, that said, we sympathize overall with the robbers, I would say, even though they're stealing for not great reasons. Well, they are stealing for higher reasons than just wanting money, except for money himself. So the teens could be sympathetic. We could see them as bad, especially through the lens of money. But we root for them. We definitely root for Rocky and Alex, no question. So that leads me to the logical endpoint of all this I've been talking about. Moral ambiguity. So, the blind man is not a monster, as we established, and the robbers, even though they're doing something morally questionable, to say the least, with robbing this man, which could be, seen as really, as Alex puts it, fucked up, because he's, a veteran, and he's blind. So they're doing something that is not great, morally speaking, but at the end of the day, the reason they're doing it is because they're victims of a society that privileges the wealthy. The blind man included, because the blind man doesn't get justice because the person who ran over his kid, she got off because she has money. And, of course, Rocky is poor. I think we can assume that money doesn't come from the best background. So they're in a very stratified society here in Detroit, where the wealthy are overprivileged, right? And that sort of is what leads these characters to doing the actions they do. They're not doing these actions because they're bad people at their core or anything like that. And the movie really underscores that by showing us that conventional morality really isn't a factor here, because yes, the blind man is an atheist, and if we wanted to look at this simplistically, we could say that makes him bad, that makes him a demon. He totally looks like one with his creepy eyes. But something I noticed that you may have missed, and I'll pull up the clip really quick. This dude right here, who the three robbers work for, he's wearing a cross. And of course, if he's buying these stolen items, he's not doing something very moral, now is he? So, in other words, religion has no bearing, and more broadly speaking, conventional morality doesn't have any bearing on what kind of person someone is in the world of this movie, which, could also be said to be true in the real world, where there are evil people who do evil things, but there are no monsters in the horror movie sense, as it were. But overall, this is a complete subversion of the morality play format we often see in slasher movies, where those who get killed deserve it because they're unquestionably bad people. But this movie shows that there's good and bad in everyone. Conventional morality has no bearing on what kind of person someone is, unlike in other movies like where exorcists who are good Christians come to defeat the demon, or whatever it might be. So, in other words, its morality is very gray in the world of Don't Breathe. It's not all black and white. And so, you might be asking, how does that tie into what our paper is supposed to be about of representation of the disabled in Don't Breathe? Well, I think it ties into it in the sense of the movie is really underscoring that the blind man is just like everyone else. He shouldn't be othered. He's not a monster. He's a flawed person, like we see in real life, but he's just that, a person. And as we talked about before, he shatters stereotypes. He's capable even outside his home, and his other senses are not quote-unquote stronger to quote-unquote compensate for his blindness. So, yeah, I would say it's a very good representation of of the blind, and I'll also pull up a quote I thought really exemplified that. This article I found says, what makes the film such a fantastic piece of representation is that Don't Breathe never once underestimates or overestimates the skills or the capability of the twisted killer at its heart. So, he's not superpowered, he's not powerless, he's just a regular blind person. So, that is what definitely, I think that nicely encapsulates how it goes about representing him. Don't Breathe 2 is a different story, and I think that's really interesting because in Don't Breathe 2, spoilers, the blind man has an adopted daughter, but it turns out that she is, or he poses as her biological father, but her real father comes to quote-unquote save her, but it turns out her real father and his wife have this evil plan to steal the heart of Phoenix to give it to the mom because she's dying from meth use and needs a new heart. So it is definitely different because we have a clear bad person, a clear villain who is definitely totally bad. In the form of Josephine, her mom, who wants to steal her heart. So yeah, she is very bad. I mean, her motives are totally selfish, and it's not like she lost a child in a car accident like the blind man. She literally was doing meth, which also is, bad. So, she's pretty much totally bad, and she's in a wheelchair, and it definitely does seem to be a case of narrative prosthesis. She's bad, and she has a bad heart, both literally and figuratively. What's more, the blind man punishes Raylan, Josephine's husband, and the father of this girl, who the blind man adopted and wants to protect. He punishes him by gouging out his eyes, as if to say, isn't being blind a horrible thing that you should suffer? So, that's not the greatest message you can send toward the blind community. So, it really is a weird step back. They also take away all of the nuance, and that the blind man, he becomes a saint. As Money said, just because you're blind, that doesn't make you a saint. True. But in this, he becomes a saint by saving this girl, and he even repents for everything bad he did before, and sacrifices himself. So he's no longer in between. He is no longer liminal. So that is a bummer. So I really enjoyed the sequel, but I don't think it's the best in terms of disability representation. given how much it leans into narrative prosthesis and how it makes being blind seem like a bad thing and a punishment, and how it takes away all the subtlety of and all the moral ambiguity that we see in the first one. But I think the first one really does a good job of showing just how human the blind man is, and as such, I would call it a great piece of representation. And those are my thoughts on Don't Breathe. Of course, feel free to work off of what I have said, agree, disagree, use my thoughts in any way you see fit. And hopefully this helped you come up with things you can talk about in the paper. Alright, thank you guys, and I'll see y'all next time.